daughter forgot to hang up the phone. I heard. He has to go to a nursing home. I didn't say anything. They sold the house for $890,000. They returned from a business trip, smiling until the key fit. On the doorstep they found a note, and when they read it, they started screaming. The silence in the house was a living thing. It had weight and texture, clinging to the floral wallpaper and pooling in the hollows of the worn armchair where Eleanor used to sit. Arthur felt it most in the late afternoons, when the sun slanted through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light, tiny, frantic ghosts in a space that had once been filled with laughter. Now, the only sound was the solemn tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each swing of its brass pendulum measuring out another second of his solitude. He sat at the kitchen table, a chipped porcelain mug of lukewarm tea held between his liver-spotted hands. He hadn't meant for it to get cold. He'd made it an hour ago, but then he'd found himself staring out at the rose bushes Eleanor had planted, their crimson heads bowed under the weight of a recent rain, and his mind had wandered. It had been a year since he'd buried her, but the grief was not a wound that was healing. It was a landscape, and he was a permanent resident. The front door clicked open, and the silence shattered. "Dad? We're here." Clara's voice, always a little too loud, a little too bright, sliced through the quiet. It was the voice of someone perpetually in a hurry, someone for whom silence was an inconvenience to be filled. Ben, her husband, followed behind her, his footsteps heavy on the polished oak floors. He was carrying 2 grocery bags, a look of strained magnanimity on his face. "We brought you some things," Ben announced, setting the bags on the counter with a thud. "Didn't want you having to go out." Arthur forced a smile, the muscles in his face feeling stiff and unused. "That's very kind of you, Ben." "Thank you." He looked into the bags. Organic kale, quinoa, almond milk. It was the food of his daughter's world, not his. He missed his simple cheese sandwiches and the occasional steak pie. "And I cleared your appointment with Dr. Evans for Friday," Clara said, already scrolling through her phone, her thumb a blur against the screen. She didn't look up. "Ben can take you. I've got that quarterly review, it's just impossible for me to get away." "Of course, dear. I understand." He did understand. He understood that her life was a whirlwind of meetings and deadlines, a sleek, modern machine that had no room for a lumbering, old-fashioned component like him. He was a loose end, a problem to be managed. They moved through the house with an air of brisk ownership, their conversation a volley of topics he couldn't grasp. Stock options, a new client, reservations at a restaurant with a name he couldn't pronounce. He felt like a spectator in his own home, a piece of antique furniture they had to navigate around. Clara opened the refrigerator, her lips thinning in disapproval. "Dad, this milk is expired." "And is this leftover stew? From when? You can't eat this." She swept the containers into the trash with an air of hygienic authority. "This is why we bring you groceries. You have to be more careful." Each word was a small, sharp pebble thrown at him. He knew he was forgetful sometimes. His mind wasn't the steel trap it used to be. But the way she said it, without a shred of gentleness, made him feel not just old but incompetent. Decrepit. He lowered his gaze to his hands, tracing the roadmap of veins that crisscrossed the thin skin. These were the hands that had built a crib for her, that had taught her to ride a bicycle, that had held Eleanor's until the very end. Now they couldn't be trusted to check the date on a milk carton. "I was going to throw it out," he mumbled, a weak defense that he knew was pointless. They stayed for precisely 45 minutes, the duration of a television sitcom. They filled his refrigerator with their healthy, tasteless food, chattered about their impending business trip to Aspen. "It's a conference, but we're extending for a few days, to ski," Ben had said with a self-satisfied grin, and then, just as abruptly as they had arrived, they were leaving. "All right, Dad, we've got to run," Clara said, kissing the air somewhere near his cheek. Her perfume, a sharp, citrusy scent, lingered after she pulled away. "We'll call you from Aspen. Make sure you take your pills. They're in the blue dispenser, remember?" "I'll remember." He watched from the doorway as they climbed into their gleaming black SUV, a vehicle that looked more like a spaceship than a car. It hummed quietly to life and then purred down the street, disappearing around the corner. The silence rushed back in, colder and heavier than before. He closed the door and leaned against it, the wood cool against his back. He felt a profound weariness settle deep in his bones. It was the exhaustion of trying to matter to people who had already filed you away. He shuffled back to the kitchen to put away the new groceries, his movements slow and deliberate. As he reached for the almond milk, he noticed Clara had left her phone on the counter, its glossy surface reflecting the kitchen light. She was always leaving it behind. She would call it from Ben's phone in a minute, he was sure. He was about to move it to the living room side table, a more visible spot, when the screen lit up. Ben's name flashed, accompanied by a picture of the two of them on a beach, smiling, their teeth impossibly white. Arthur's finger hovered over the screen. He shouldn't. It was an invasion of her privacy. But a desperate, lonely curiosity got the better of him. He pressed the green icon. He meant to just say, "Clara, you've left your phone," but he fumbled, his thumb accidentally hitting the speakerphone button as he brought it to his ear. Clara's voice, tinny and sharp, filled the kitchen. But she wasn't talking to him. She must have pocket-dialed Ben, or perhaps he'd answered and she didn't realize. "Can't believe how much the place has gone downhill," she was saying, the sound of road noise a low hiss behind her words. "Did you see the dust on the mantelpiece? And that smell in the fridge? It's just not safe for him anymore, Ben." "I know, honey. We're doing the right thing," Ben's voice rumbled back, soothing and conspiratorial. Arthur froze, the phone clutched in his hand. His heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. "He has to go to a nursing home," Clara stated. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a verdict. A final, cold judgment. "We can't be his caretakers forever. It's not fair to us. We have our own lives to build. And once he's settled at Silver Creek, I've already looked at their brochure, it's quite nice, we can finally sell the house. Mr. Abernathy, the realtor, said we could easily get 8, maybe 900,000 for it in this market." The room seemed to tilt. Arthur grabbed the edge of the counter to steady himself. The numbers she spoke were obscene, astronomical. They weren't talking about a house, they were talking about a jackpot. His home. The home he and Eleanor had built from nothing, every memory etched into its walls, every scuff on the floor a story. "That would be enough to get our startup off the ground, for sure," Ben said, his voice laced with an excitement that made Arthur's stomach churn. "A clean break. It's for the best. For everyone." "Exactly," Clara agreed. "It's for his own good. He'll be happier with people his own age." The line went dead. The call had ended. But the words remained, hanging in the air, vibrating in the oppressive silence. "He has to go to a nursing home. We can finally sell the house." Arthur lowered the phone and placed it carefully back on the counter, his movements stiff, robotic. A coldness spread from his chest outwards, seeping into his limbs, chilling him to the bone. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone. The utter lack of warmth, of sadness, of conflict. It was the sound of a business transaction. He was a line item on their budget, an obstacle to their ambitions. The care, the groceries, the hurried visits, it was all a performance, a prelude to the final act of getting rid of him. He looked around the kitchen. The familiar pattern of the linoleum floor. The faint scent of cinnamon that always clung to the air, a phantom from Eleanor's baking days. The crayon drawing Clara had made when she was 6, framed and hung by the pantry door. A lopsided house with a smiling sun. His home. A tear, hot and sharp, escaped his eye and tracked a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, crystalline rage. They thought he was a doddering old fool. A relic to be discarded. They thought this house was theirs for the taking. He stood there for a long time as the afternoon light faded to a bruised purple twilight. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 5, its chimes echoing through the empty rooms. For the first time in a year, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like a decision. Sleep did not come. Arthur lay in the vast emptiness of the bed he had once shared with Eleanor, the sheets cold and unforgiving against his skin. The silence of the night was different from the silence of the day. It was deeper, more absolute, and it offered no distractions from the words that played on a torturous loop in his mind. "He has to go to a nursing home. We can finally sell the house." Each phrase was a fresh turn of a knife in a wound he hadn't known existed. He had thought the greatest pain was losing Eleanor. He was wrong. The slow, calculated betrayal by his own child was a misery of a different sort, a living, breathing poison. He finally gave up on the pretense of rest as the first pale, gray fingers of dawn began to probe the edges of the bedroom curtains. A new energy, born of fury and a profound, aching sorrow, propelled him out of bed. He dressed not in his usual soft-worn cardigan and slippers, but in a sturdy pair of trousers and a flannel shirt, as if preparing for a difficult task. He moved through the downstairs rooms, seeing them now not as his home but as a crime scene. The chair Clara had sat in, the spot on the counter where her phone had rested, they were all tainted. He couldn't breathe here. He needed to be somewhere that was wholly his and Eleanor's, a place untouched by Clara's ambition. There was only one such place left. The attic. The pull-down cord for the attic stairs was tucked away in the hallway closet. It felt heavy in his hand, the frayed rope coarse against his palm. With a groan of protest from both his shoulders and the ancient spring mechanism, the wooden ladder unfolded, landing with a solid thud on the floorboards. The air that descended was a physical presence. A cool, still column smelling of cedar, dried paper, and the faint, ghostly scent of Eleanor's lavender sachets. He climbed slowly, his knees aching in complaint. Each step was a deliberate movement away from the present and into the past. The attic was their sanctuary, their museum of a shared life. It was dim, illuminated only by the light filtering through a single grime-coated circular window at the far end. Great white ghosts of dust-sheeted furniture populated the space. Sunlight streamed through the dirty glass, catching the swirling dust in a hazy, reverent beam. Arthur ran a hand over a sheet-draped form, recognizing the familiar shape of Eleanor's painting easel. She hadn't painted in her last few years, her hands too stiffened by arthritis, but she could never bear to part with it. Stacked against the wall were canvases she'd stretched herself, all blank, waiting for images they would now never hold. He walked deeper into the cavern of their history, past towers of carefully labeled boxes, Clara's school papers, Christmas ornaments, photographs 1970 to 1980. He felt a pang of irony looking at the box with his daughter's name on it. He wondered if any of her carefully preserved report cards mentioned her aptitude for cold-blooded calculation. He sank onto an old steamer trunk, the leather cracking in protest. He needed a reminder of the woman he had loved, a reminder that the goodness he believed in had once been real. He decided to look for the photographs from their trip to the coast, the one they took for their 40th anniversary. He remembered a picture of Eleanor, her gray hair whipped by the sea wind, laughing with a joy so pure it had seemed to stop time. He needed to see that smile again. The box labeled Photographs 1990 to 2000 was tucked behind the steamer trunk, under a pile of old blankets. As he pulled it out, his fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. He nudged the blankets aside. There, nestled in the shadows, was a small dark green lockbox, the kind used for important papers. It was heavy, made of solid steel with an ornate brass lock. He didn't recognize it. It was not the simple tin box where they kept their birth certificates and the deed to the house. This was something different. Something of Eleanor's he had never seen. His curiosity, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months, was a flicker of warmth in his cold anger. He lifted the box onto the trunk. It was locked tight. There was no key in sight. He sat for a moment, thinking. Eleanor was not a creature of impulse, she was methodical, logical. A key would not be hidden randomly. It would be somewhere meaningful. He made his way to a small wooden chest of drawers that held her hobby supplies, spools of thread, dried flowers for pressing, half-finished needlepoint projects. In the bottom drawer, beneath a bundle of faded silk ribbons, was her old jewelry box. He opened it. The familiar scent of her perfume, faint and powdery, rose to meet him. He saw the string of pearls he'd given her for her 30th birthday, the silver locket with a tiny worn picture of a baby Clara inside. No key. Then he remembered her books. She had loved poetry, and she had a habit of pressing flowers or tucking notes between the pages of her favorite volumes. A stack of them sat in a crate near the window. He knelt, his knees cracking, and began to sift through them. In a well-worn copy of Mary Oliver's poems, tucked into the crease of the page containing her favorite poem, When Death Comes, was a small, ornate brass key tied with a piece of blue velvet ribbon. His heart hammered against his ribs. It had to be it. With trembling hands, he carried the key back to the trunk and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. He lifted the heavy lid. The contents were not what he expected. There were no sentimental letters or dried flowers. The box was packed with official-looking documents, bound in legal blue covers and secured with thick paper clips. His breath caught in his throat. On top of the stack was a thick envelope with his name, Arthur, written in Eleanor's elegant, familiar script. He carefully tore it open. The letter inside was dated 10 years ago. "My dearest Arthur," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I can only hope that you are finding some peace in our home. I love you more than these words could ever say. You are the kindest man I have ever known, and sometimes your kindness makes you blind to the parts of the world that are not so kind. It is one of the things I love most about you. I am writing this because I need to explain the contents of this box. I have done something without telling you, not to deceive you but to protect you. To protect us. I have seen a hardness in Clara for many years, a drive that leaves little room for sentiment or empathy. I have seen the way she looks at this house, the way she speaks of our things. She sees them not as a legacy of love but as assets. I pray I am wrong, my love. I pray with all my heart that she proves to be the daughter you have always seen in her. But I cannot leave our future and yours to prayer alone. The house is no longer in my name or in yours. 10 years ago I used a small inheritance from my aunt to establish an irrevocable trust, the Eleanor Vance Homestead Trust. I have placed our home into this trust. The legal documents are all here. You, my darling, are named as the lifetime tenant. You have the sole and indisputable right to live in this house undisturbed for the rest of your natural life. No one can ever force you to leave. But you are not the owner. Upon your passing, the house is not to be inherited by Clara. The sole owner and trustee is my sister Margaret." Arthur stopped reading, the paper shaking in his hand. Margaret. Eleanor's younger sister. A kind, gentle woman who lived quietly in a small coastal town. Clara had despised her aunt for years, deeming her unambitious and provincial. The sisters had grown distant, a rift largely engineered by Clara's subtle manipulations and complaints. He pulled out the largest document from the box. The legal jargon was dense, but the key phrases leapt out at him. Irrevocable trust. Grantor, Eleanor Vance. Trustee, Margaret Vance. Lifetime tenant, Arthur Penhaligon. He read it again, and then a third time, the magnitude of his wife's foresight washing over him in a powerful, staggering wave. She had known. All those years ago she had seen the seed of greed in their daughter and had taken silent, decisive action to protect the life they had built together. This wasn't an act of distrust in him, but an act of profound, preemptive love. She had shielded him from a battle she knew he would be too gentle-hearted to fight. He leaned back against a stack of old magazines, the legal document resting in his lap. The rage that had been a burning fire inside him now cooled into something harder, stronger. It turned to steel. Clara and Ben weren't just planning to swindle a grieving old man out of his home. They were attempting to sell a property they had no more legal right to than the strangers walking by on the street. He looked at the dusty beam of light cutting through the attic gloom. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt her presence not as a painful absence but as a guiding force. She had left him one last gift. She had left him a weapon. His gaze fell upon the trust document again, on the name of the trustee. Margaret Vance. A plan, audacious and terrifying and absolutely perfect, began to form in the quiet of the attic, a silent promise to the ghost of the woman who had loved him enough to see the truth. The attic, once a sanctuary of memory, now felt like a war room. Arthur sat on the dusty steamer trunk for what felt like hours, the legal documents spread across his lap, the weight of them both a burden and a shield. The initial shock had receded, leaving behind the cold, hard landscape of decision. He saw his path diverge into two distinct roads. The first was the road of confrontation. He could march downstairs, wait for Clara's next perfunctory visit, and slap the trust documents down on the kitchen table. He could watch her face, that smooth, confident mask she wore, crumble into disbelief, then anger, then denial. There would be shouting. Accusations of senility, of his grief-addled mind inventing conspiracies. She would call him cruel, paranoid. She would twist it somehow to be his fault. The thought of that battle, of the sheer ugliness of it, exhausted him to his very soul. It would be a messy, brutal war of attrition, and he knew Clara, with her boundless, youthful energy for conflict, would eventually wear him down. Then there was the second road. A quieter, more treacherous path that wound through shadows and silence. It was the road Eleanor had paved for him. A road that required not a frontal assault but strategy, patience, and an ally he hadn't spoken to in nearly 5 years. Margaret. The name felt foreign on his tongue. He pictured her face, so much like Eleanor's but softer around the eyes, less weathered by the world. Clara had made sure that relationship withered on the vine. After Eleanor's diagnosis, Clara had insulated them, becoming the sole gatekeeper of their lives. Aunt Margaret just upsets Mom, all her talk about natural remedies and faith healing, she'd say with a dismissive eye roll. Or, honestly Dad, her calls just exhaust you both. She doesn't understand the pressure we're under. Arthur, overwhelmed by his duties as a caretaker, had let the connection slide, accepting Clara's narrative. He saw now with sickening clarity that it wasn't about protecting her parents. It was about isolating them, ensuring her influence was absolute. The thought of calling Margaret felt like a betrayal, a muscle memory of loyalty to Clara that was hard to overcome. But then he heard his daughter's voice again, sharp and clinical, sentencing him to a home and liquidating his life. That wasn't his daughter. That was a stranger. His loyalty belonged to the woman who had loved him enough to plan for this very moment, the woman who had trusted her sister when she could no longer trust her own child. His hand tightened on the documents. He would take the second road. He descended the attic stairs, closing the portal to the past behind him. Downstairs, the house was just a house again, but now he saw it through Eleanor's eyes, a fortress she had built to protect him. He went to the small mahogany desk in the living room, where Eleanor's old address book still lay in the top drawer. He ran his finger down the V section, past vendors and old veterinarians, until he found it, Vance Margaret. Her address and a phone number written in Eleanor's perfect cursive. His hand trembled as he picked up the receiver of the landline phone. The familiar weight of it was suddenly immense. He dialed the numbers slowly, each press of a button a small definitive act of rebellion. The phone began to ring on the other end, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet room. 1 ring. 2. He nearly hung up, his nerve failing him. 3 rings. Hello. A woman's voice, soft and cautious. It was unmistakably a Vance voice, carrying the same gentle cadence as Eleanor's. Arthur had to clear his throat before he could speak. Margaret? It's Arthur. Arthur Penhaligon. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end, a gap filled with 5 years of unspoken words, of distance and Christmases without cards. Arthur, she finally said, and he could hear the surprise and concern warring in her tone. My goodness. Is everything all right? Is it you? Are you well? I'm as well as can be expected, I suppose, he began, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. I'm sorry to call you out of the blue like this. Don't be silly. It's good to hear your voice, she said, though a hesitant edge remained. How are you holding up? I've thought of you so often. The genuine warmth in her voice, so absent from his life for the past year, almost broke him. He took a steadying breath. There was no easy way to do this. Margaret, something has happened. Something I need to talk to you about. It's about Clara. He heard her sharp intake of breath. What has she done? There was no surprise in her question, only a weary resignation that spoke volumes. And so it all poured out of him. He told her about the loneliness, the feeling of being a burden, and then, his voice dropping to a near whisper, he recounted the phone call. He relayed the conversation word for word, the cold, businesslike tone, the talk of the nursing home, the dollar signs they'd attached to his home. He spoke without emotion, letting the sheer, unvarnished cruelty of the facts speak for themselves. When he finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy and profound. He could hear her breathing, a slow, controlled rhythm. I see, she finally said, her voice dangerously quiet. So, my sister's fears were not unfounded. Fears? Arthur asked, his heart clenching. Eleanor, she called me about 10 years ago. She was worried, Arthur. She saw a coldness in Clara, a transactional way of looking at the world, at people. She was afraid of what would happen to you, to the home you both loved, if she were to go first. She made me promise I wouldn't say anything unless I absolutely had to. She didn't want you to have to see your daughter that way. Margaret's voice cracked with a decade of held-back sorrow. Oh, Arthur, I am so sorry. I had hoped and prayed she was wrong. Now was the moment. She wasn't wrong, Margaret. And she did more than worry. I was in the attic today. I found a lockbox. He told her about the key, the letter, and the thick, legal document that now lay on the desk in front of him. The Eleanor Vance Homestead Trust, he said, the name feeling powerful as he spoke it aloud. She named you as the trustee. Yes, Margaret said simply. I know. My copy is in a safe deposit box here. It was the hardest secret I've ever had to keep from you, Arthur. A wave of relief so powerful it made him dizzy washed over him. He wasn't mad. He wasn't imagining things. He was armed. They're coming back from their trip in 2 weeks, Arthur said, his voice gaining a strength he didn't know he possessed. They've already spoken to a realtor. They're going to try and sell it the minute they get back. We can't let them, Margaret said fiercely. I'll call a lawyer. I'll send them a cease and desist. I will come down there myself and throw them out on their ear. Her anger was a balm to his wounded spirit, but it wasn't the right path. That was the first road, the road of confrontation. Eleanor had given them the means to take the second. No, Arthur said, the idea crystallizing in his mind, sharp and clear. No, that's what they'd expect. A fight. Let's not give them one. Margaret was quiet, listening. Let them, Arthur continued, a strange, cold calm settling over him. Let them hire their fancy realtor. Let them stage the house and hold open houses. Let them find a buyer and draw up the paperwork. Let them do all the work. He paused, taking a breath. And while they're busy selling a house that doesn't belong to them, you and I, Margaret, we will sell it for real. He heard a sharp gasp on the other end of the line, followed by a long, drawn-out silence. He wondered if he'd gone too far, if this sounded like the ramblings of a vengeful old man. Then he heard a sound he didn't expect. A soft, low chuckle. Oh, Eleanor, Margaret whispered, a mixture of awe and amusement in her voice. You brilliant, brilliant woman. You always did love a good bit of theater. Her voice grew firm, all trace of hesitation gone, replaced by a steely resolve that matched his own. All right, Arthur. Let's do it. Let's give them exactly what they deserve. When Arthur hung up the phone, the house no longer felt empty. The silence was not the silence of loneliness, but the quiet of plotting, of a shared purpose. He looked at the phone, then at the trust documents. He was not just a grieving widower anymore. He was a custodian of Eleanor's final, brilliant plan. He was an ally. And the game, he thought with a grim smile, had just begun. Clara and Ben returned from Aspen looking bronzed and victorious, radiating the smug, vibrant health of people whose lives were running precisely on schedule. They breezed into the house 2 days after Arthur's call with Margaret, bringing with them a blast of cold mountain air and the scent of expensive leather. They found Arthur sitting in his armchair by the window, a book open but unread in his lap. He had been waiting. Dad, we're back, Clara announced, dropping a glossy shopping bag from a designer store onto the coffee table. We brought you a cashmere scarf. The air's getting a chill. The gesture was so perfectly, transparently false that it almost made him laugh. A cashmere scarf to keep him warm in the nursing home she was shipping him off to. He touched the impossibly soft wool, then looked up at them, carefully arranging his features into a mask of gentle, weary confusion. He had rehearsed this in the mirror. He let his shoulders slump. He kept his eyes watery and unfocused. That's lovely, dear, he said, his voice a soft, reedy version of his own. How was your trip? They launched into a breathless account of ski slopes and chalet dinners, their words painting a picture of a world so far removed from his own it felt like a different planet. Arthur nodded and made small, encouraging sounds, the perfect audience. He was a ghost at his own wake. When they finally ran out of steam, a calculated, serious quiet fell over the room. This was it. Dad, Clara began, pulling a dining chair over to face him, her knees almost touching his. She leaned forward, her expression a masterclass in feigned sincerity. Ben and I did a lot of thinking while we were away. About you. About the future. Ben stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, a silent, supportive monolith. They looked like a pair of compassionate interventionists from a television drama. We're worried about you here, all alone in this big house, she continued, her voice syrupy with concern. It's too much for you to manage. The upkeep, the cooking, we saw that expired milk, Dad. What if you had gotten sick? We can't bear the thought. Arthur looked down at his hands, feigning shame. I know I've been a bit forgetful. It's not your fault, Ben chimed in, his voice a low, reasonable baritone. It's just a part of life. And we feel we need to be proactive in finding a care solution that gives you the support you need and us peace of mind. There was that word. Solution. He was a problem to be solved. We want you to be in a community, Clara said, reaching out to pat his hand. Her touch was cool and brief. With people your own age, with activities and nurses on call. A place called Silver Creek. It's beautiful. More like a resort, really. And the best part is, selling this house would more than cover the cost. It would set you up for life, with no financial worries at all. He looked from her face to Ben's, letting the silence stretch. He allowed a single tear to well in his eye, a testament to his broken heart. He saw the flicker of triumph in Clara's eyes, quickly masked by another wave of pity. She thought she had won. She thought he was broken. My home, he whispered, the words trembling with manufactured grief. Eleanor, she loved this house. And Mom would want you to be safe, Clara countered smoothly, her response ready and rehearsed. She would want you to be cared for. This isn't an ending, Dad. It's about right-sizing your life for this new chapter. He closed his eyes, a gesture of ultimate defeat. If you think it's for the best, he murmured, letting his voice trail off into a sigh of resignation. I'm just so tired. The relief in the room was palpable. Clara and Ben exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated success. They had expected a fight, a tantrum, a messy emotional battle. His swift, weary capitulation was more than they could have hoped for. They moved with terrifying speed. The very next afternoon Mr. Abernathy arrived. He was a tall man in a suit that was too tight at the shoulders, with a dazzling white smile and the predatory eyes of a shark. He strode through the house, his voice booming as he pointed out assets. Great bones here, fantastic natural light. The original hardwood is a huge plus. We'll need to depersonalize, of course. Get rid of the clutter. Arthur watched as this stranger, this smarmy salesman, assessed his life's work as clutter. He saw Mr. Abernathy glance at him, a quick, dismissive appraisal before turning back to Clara. He'll be out before we list, of course? Of course, Clara confirmed. We're just finalizing the arrangements for his new place. The performance was the hardest thing Arthur had ever done. The following Monday the stagers arrived, 2 young women with clipboards and an air of impersonal efficiency. They descended upon the house like locusts, armed with packing tape and bubble wrap. Arthur watched, a silent statue in the corner of the living room, as they began to dismantle his life. They wrapped Eleanor's porcelain birds in tissue paper, their delicate forms disappearing into a cardboard box labeled Decor Misc. They took down the framed photos from the mantelpiece, Clara's graduation, his wedding day, a family vacation from a lifetime ago, and replaced them with a single, generic print of a beige flower. He felt a hot, volcanic rage building in his chest, so powerful it made him feel lightheaded. He wanted to scream at them to get their hands off his memories, to throw them out of his home. Instead, he shuffled into the kitchen. "Can I get you ladies a cup of tea?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly, which he hoped they'd interpret as the frailty of old age, not suppressed fury. While they worked, he would retreat to his bedroom, the only room they had agreed to leave untouched for now. There, he would close the door, take a deep, shuddering breath, and wait until his hands stopped shaking. The nights were his salvation. After the house fell silent, he would go into his study, pull out the cheap, prepaid burner phone he'd bought for cash at a corner store, and dial Margaret's number. "How is it going?" Her voice would come, a warm, conspiratorial whisper across the line. "They've packed up the porcelain birds," he'd report, the words tasting like ash. "And they've replaced the curtains with gray sheets of nothing." "Stay strong, Arthur," she'd reply, her voice a steel rod in his spine. "You're doing wonderfully. My agent here is named Susan. She's lovely. She understands completely. We're not listing it publicly just as we planned. She's showing it privately to a young family she knows, a doctor and his wife with 2 little girls. They're looking for a home with character, a place to put down roots." The thought of 2 little girls running through these halls, of laughter filling the silence again, was the only thing that kept him going. He and Margaret would talk through the logistics, fine-tuning their shadow plan while Clara and Ben slept soundly, dreaming of their windfall. One evening, Ben found him in the living room, staring at a blank space on the wall where a painting of Eleanor's had hung for 30 years. Ben, in a rare moment of what seemed like genuine curiosity, picked up an old photo album the stagers had left on a side table. He flipped it open. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing to a picture of a younger Eleanor standing beside a smiling, dark-haired woman. Arthur's heart stopped. It was Margaret. "Oh," he said, forcing a casual tone. "That's just Eleanor's sister. We weren't close. Haven't seen her in years." "Huh," Ben said, losing interest and closing the album. "She looks a bit like Eleanor." He clapped Arthur on the shoulder. "You're being a real trooper through all this, Art. We appreciate it. It'll all be worth it in the end." "Oh, you have no idea," Arthur thought, a grim smile playing on his lips for a fraction of a second before he replaced it with his mask of benign sorrow. By the end of the week, the house was unrecognizable. It was a sterile beige showroom scrubbed clean of any personality, any love, any life. Neutral furniture sat in cold, geometric arrangements. The air smelled of paint and industrial cleaner. Clara was ecstatic. "It looks incredible, doesn't it, Dad?" she chirped, walking through the living room. "So much bigger. Mr. Abernathy says we can officially list it for $890,000. He thinks we'll have an offer before we even get back from our trip." Arthur stood in the center of the room, this place that was once his sanctuary. He looked at his reflection in a large, frameless mirror the stagers had hung on the main wall. He saw a stooped, gray-haired old man, his eyes hollow, his frame thin and defeated. A man who looked like he belonged in a nursing home. A man who had given up. It was the performance of a lifetime. And they were giving him a standing ovation. The for sale sign hammered into the front lawn by Mr. Abernathy's assistant felt like a declaration of war. It was a garish, bold-faced lie, proclaiming Clara and Ben's authority to the entire neighborhood. Arthur watched from the living room window, his reflection a pale, ghostly image superimposed over the sign's triumphant lettering. The performance was now public. Mr. Abernathy's strategy was aggressive. An open house was scheduled for the first Saturday. "We'll have a flood of people through," he boomed over the phone to Clara, a conversation she'd taken on speaker, assuming Arthur was too deaf or disinterested to listen. "Generates a buzz. A little competition never hurts." On the day of the open house, Arthur was confined to his bedroom under strict instructions from Clara. "It's just better this way, Dad," she'd said, her tone suggesting it was for his own comfort, when they both knew it was because a sad old man sitting in the corner was bad for sales. "Just rest. We'll tell you when it's over." For 3 hours, he sat on his bed and listened to the floorboards creak under the weight of strangers. He heard their muffled voices, their footsteps in the hall, in the rooms where he and Eleanor had lived and loved. He heard Mr. Abernathy's slick, practiced sales pitch drifting up the stairs, words like potential, footprint, and cosmetic updates. He was selling a shell, a container, not a home. That evening, Clara and Ben were electric with excitement. "We had an incredible turnout," Ben announced, leaning against Arthur's doorframe. "And we already have 2 offers, both over asking. One is from a developer. He wants to tear down the back wall, put in a massive kitchen, a real showstopper." Arthur felt a physical revulsion. He pictured Eleanor's rose garden being bulldozed for a marble patio. He nodded slowly, making his eyes look wide and a little lost. "That's a lot of money," he said, playing his part. "It certainly is," Clara said, beaming. "We're taking the developer's offer. It's the cleanest, all cash. No messing around." They were blinded by the number, just as Eleanor had predicted. Later, when the house was finally submerged in the deep silence of midnight, Arthur crept into his study. The burner phone felt cool and solid in his palm. He dialed. "How did it go?" Margaret's voice was a lifeline. "They held an open house," he whispered, the words tasting sour. "They have an offer from a developer. All cash. They want to gut the place." He heard Margaret sigh on the other end, a sound of profound sadness. "Oh, Arthur. That's just what Ellie was afraid of." She paused, and then her voice became firm again. "Well, our news is better. Susan took the Hamiltons through yesterday morning before you were even awake. Dr. Hamilton and his wife, Sarah." "And?" Arthur asked, his heart thumping. They fell in love with it, Margaret said, and he could hear the genuine smile in her voice. Sarah loved the reading nook by the bay window. The doctor was measuring the backyard for a swing set. Their little girls were tracing the height marks you carved on the kitchen door frame. They don't want to change a thing, Arthur. They want to raise their family there. They've made an offer. It's not as high as your developer, but it's fair. It's right. A feeling of warmth spread through Arthur's chest. That's what Eleanor would have wanted, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Now for the tricky part, Margaret said. The inspections. Our buyers need to schedule one. And I assume Clara's will too. The logistical nightmare presented itself immediately. Clara informed him the next day. The inspector is coming on Thursday at 10 a.m., Dad. It'll take a few hours. You'll have to make yourself scarce. Maybe Ben can take you out for a long lunch. Arthur's mind raced. He had to get them out of the house on a different day for a different inspector. He relayed the information to Margaret that night. They devised a plan. It was risky. It relied entirely on his ability to act. On Wednesday morning, Arthur woke up and began the most demanding performance of his life. When Ben came down for breakfast, he found Arthur sitting at the kitchen table, pale and clutching his chest, a half-empty glass of water trembling in his hand. "Dad? Are you okay?" Ben asked, his voice sharp with alarm. I'm not sure," Arthur wheezed, taking a shallow, ragged breath. "A little dizzy. And this pressure in my chest. It's probably nothing. Just indigestion." "Indigestion? Dad, you look terrible. We're going to the clinic." Ben was already reaching for his car keys. No, it's not necessary," Arthur protested weakly, just enough to make it believable. "I don't want to be a bother. You have work to do. Don't be ridiculous. I'm taking you. Clara would kill me if I didn't." It was perfect. While Ben helped him to the car, fussing over him with a frantic, guilty energy, Arthur managed to send a one-word text to Margaret from the burner phone in his pocket. Now. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in deception. At the clinic, Arthur exaggerated his symptoms just enough to warrant a lengthy examination. The doctor, a young, earnest man, ran an EKG and a series of tests, all of which, to Ben's immense relief, came back perfectly normal. The doctor chalked it up to anxiety and stress. A mild panic attack, perhaps. "It's very common, especially after a major life change," he said, looking pointedly at Ben. Ben had the decency to look ashamed. On the drive home he was solicitous and apologetic. "I'm sorry, Dad. This has all been a lot for you. We're pushing too hard." Arthur simply nodded, his eyes closed, feigning exhaustion. But on the inside, his heart was pounding with a thrilling, terrifying victory. When they pulled into the driveway, the house was silent and empty. Susan, Margaret's realtor, had just texted Margaret, who had relayed the message to Arthur's real phone, all clear. Inspector is gone. No major issues. The final hurdle came 2 days before Clara and Ben's departure. They sat him down at the dining room table, a sheaf of papers and a pen placed in front of him. "This is just the formal acceptance of the offer, Dad," Clara explained, pointing to a line at the bottom of the page. "And a consent form acknowledging the sale. Mr. Abernathy needs your signature on it." Arthur knew the documents were legally worthless. He wasn't the owner. But to them this was the linchpin. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking convincingly. He squinted at the paper. "There are so many words," he mumbled, playing the part of a confused old man overwhelmed by legalese. He looked up at Clara, his eyes wide and pleading. "Are you sure about this, dear? It all seems so final." "It's for the best, Dad. Trust us," she said, her voice softening with condescending reassurance. He took a deep, shaky breath and scrawled his name on the line. His signature was a barely legible tremor of ink, the signature of a man who had been defeated. That night, a courier delivered a discreet envelope. Inside was the real contract of sale drafted by Margaret's lawyer. It was for the sale of the house to the Hamilton family, authorized by the sole trustee of the Eleanor Vance Homestead Trust. There was a separate document for him, a simple declaration relinquishing his rights as lifetime tenant upon the successful closing of the sale. He sat at Eleanor's desk, the same one where she kept her address book, and took out his own good fountain pen. In the dead quiet of the house he signed his name. The signature was not the spidery scrawl he had given to Clara, but his own true hand, firm, clear, and resolute. The next morning Clara and Ben were packing their suitcases for their trip. It was, Arthur knew, a celebration disguised as business. They were cheerful, leaving him a list of emergency numbers and a refrigerator full of pre-portioned meals. "Be good, Dad," Clara said, giving him another one of her air kisses. "When we get back, we'll start making the arrangements for your move to Silver Creek. It's all going to be so much easier from here on out." Arthur watched from the doorway as their black SUV purred down the street, just as it had before. But this time he wasn't a lonely old man drowning in grief. He was a gatekeeper, a silent warrior. Tucked away safely in a FedEx envelope, ready to be sent to Margaret in the morning, was the key to their destruction. The trap was set. All he had to do now was wait for them to come home and try to turn the key in a lock that was no longer theirs. The 2 weeks that Clara and Ben were away were the strangest of Arthur's life. He lived like a polite trespasser in a house that was no longer his own. The sterile, staged furniture offered no comfort. The bare walls gave back no memories. He ate his simple meals standing at the kitchen counter and washed the single plate and fork immediately, leaving no trace of his existence. He was a ghost, haunting the hollowed-out shell of his past, waiting for a future he could barely imagine. His only connection to the real world was the nightly whispered phone call with Margaret. She was his anchor, his co-conspirator, her calm voice guiding them through the final stages of their intricate plan. "The closing is set for this coming Thursday," she informed him one evening, a week into his solitude. "Our closing. The Hamiltons are all ready. The funds will be transferred to the trust account by 5 o'clock. "And Clara's closing?" Arthur asked, the words feeling dry in his mouth. "Their realtor scheduled it for Friday afternoon. They'll be doing it remotely from their hotel in Aspen. They will attempt to sign documents for a sale that, by then, will be 24 hours obsolete. The title will have already been transferred. Their sale will be legally impossible." The quiet efficiency of it all was both terrifying and exhilarating. There was nothing left for him to do but wait for the axe to fall. On Thursday, Arthur did nothing. He sat in the unfamiliar armchair in the living room and watched the clock on the mantelpiece, a minimalist silver thing the stagers had put there, tick away the minutes. He thought of the Hamilton family, of their excitement. He pictured their 2 little girls choosing bedrooms. A part of him, the part that still ached with the raw grief of loss, felt a pang of jealousy. But a larger part felt a profound sense of rightness. The house deserved laughter again. It deserved a family that saw it as a home, not a cash machine. At 5:15, his real phone rang. It was Margaret. "It's done, Arthur," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and solemnity. "The sale is officially recorded. The house belongs to the Hamiltons. The funds are secure in the trust." He closed his eyes. "Thank you, Margaret. For everything." "Thank Eleanor," she corrected gently. "I'm just her humble messenger. Now, what about you? The taxi is confirmed for 7 a.m. tomorrow." "Yes. All confirmed. I'll be waiting for you at the station in Bayview. We'll have a cup of tea and watch the ocean." The simple promise of that small kindness was enough to steady him. After they hung up, Arthur sat in the deepening twilight, a free man in a house that was now, technically, a prison. He was a tenant with 1 night left on his lease. He decided that his last meal in this house would be one of his own choosing. He ignored the bland, healthy meals Clara had left for him and made himself a grilled cheese sandwich on white bread, with a bowl of canned tomato soup, the meal Eleanor had always made for him on rainy afternoons. He didn't eat at the cold glass dining table. Instead, he carried his plate into the empty living room and sat on the floor, his back against the wall, just as he had done as a young man when they first bought the house and had no furniture to speak of. The salty, buttery taste of the sandwich was the taste of memory itself. When he was finished, he washed his plate and began his final tour. He started in the kitchen. He ran his hand over the worn patch of linoleum by the sink where Eleanor had stood for countless hours. He could almost smell the phantom scent of yeast from the bread she used to bake, feel the warmth of the oven on a cold winter's day. He touched the series of pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe, a ladder of growth charting Clara's childhood. C. age 6. C. age 7. C. age 8. Where did that little girl go? When did she stop growing toward the sun and start growing toward shadows? In the living room he stood where his armchair had been. This was where he had read stories to Clara, where he and Eleanor had debated politics and watched old movies, her feet tucked under his leg. The room was so silent now he could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the other room, a sound he'd never noticed before. He saved the hardest room for last. Their bedroom. The stagers had left the bed but dressed it in a soulless gray duvet. He stripped it off, folding it neatly and leaving the old, familiar mattress bare. He lay down on his side of the bed, the mattress sighing under his weight. The indentation where his body fit was a perfect 40-year-old hollow. He closed his eyes and imagined Eleanor's warmth beside him, the soft sound of her breathing in the dark. "I did it, Ellie," he whispered into the empty room. "I did what you would have wanted." A single tear escaped and traced a cold path to his ear. It wasn't a tear of sadness but of farewell. His own packing was a simple affair. He had one small suitcase. Into it he placed a few changes of clothes, his shaving kit, and the worn book of Mary Oliver poems where he'd found the key. He carefully wrapped the silver-framed photograph of Eleanor on the beach, the one where she was laughing into the wind, in a soft wool sweater and placed it in the center of the suitcase. The last thing to go in was the dark green lockbox containing all of Eleanor's documents. His past and his future all in one case. The morning arrived, cloaked in a damp gray mist. Arthur rose before the sun. He showered, dressed, and carried his suitcase to the front hall. On the sterile kitchen counter he placed his old set of house keys. Beside them he laid a single, crisp white envelope. On the front, in his firmest handwriting, he had written one word: Clara. At precisely 7 a.m., a taxi pulled up to the curb. The driver, a young man with music playing softly on the radio, helped him with his suitcase. Arthur got into the back seat without a backward glance. He did not want his last image of the house to be one of abandonment. He wanted to remember it as it was, filled with love and light. The driver pulled away from the curb. Arthur could see the garish "for sale" sign still standing proudly on the lawn. A moment later, a car pulled into the driveway, the Hamiltons, arriving with a box of donuts to see their new home in the morning light. A new story was already beginning. As the taxi turned the corner, taking him away from the only home he had known for his entire adult life, Arthur did not feel the crushing despair he had anticipated. The grief was there, a deep and permanent ache. But woven through it was a new, unfamiliar thread of freedom. He was not a frail old man being shipped off to die. He was Arthur Penhaligon. And for the first time in a very long time he was heading somewhere new. Clara and Ben drove home from the airport in a state of giddy, self-congratulatory bliss. The thin mountain air of Aspen had been replaced by the familiar humid warmth of home, and they felt like conquering heroes. The final paperwork for the sale had been signed remotely the previous afternoon, a seamless digital transaction that deposited a staggering sum into an escrow account bearing their names. $890,000. The number had an almost magical quality, a beautiful, shimmering key that would unlock the life they truly deserved. "The first thing we do is pay off my student loans," Ben said, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel of the SUV. "Wipe them clean. Then we find a new office space for the startup. Something with glass walls and a view. And a new car for me," Clara added, scrolling through a luxury car dealership's website on her phone. "The lease is almost up on this thing. I'm thinking something German. Something that says we've arrived." She leaned her head back against the leather seat, a dreamy smile on her face. "And Dad? I have to admit, he was easier about it than I expected. Once he's settled at Silver Creek, he'll be so much happier. We really did the right thing." "Absolutely," Ben agreed. "We handled a difficult situation with compassion and business acumen. It's a win-win." Their conversation was a fantasy shopping list, a blueprint for a future built on the foundation of the house on Sycamore Lane. As they turned onto the familiar street, a sense of final, triumphant ownership washed over Clara. This was the last time she would see this street as a visitor. The next time, she would be driving her new car to a new life. As they pulled into the driveway, she noticed the first thing that was out of place. The garish "for sale" sign was gone. "Looks like Abernathy's on the ball," Ben chuckled. Already took the sign down. No point in advertising sold goods. Clara felt a flicker of something, not unease, but a slight disruption to the perfect narrative in her head. She shrugged it off. Of course the sign was gone. The house was sold. Their house. They got out of the car, stretching after the long flight, and walked up the familiar flagstone path. Ben was carrying the luggage and Clara, humming softly, pulled her house key from her purse. She slid it into the lock of the front door, the brass cool against her fingertips. She turned it. Nothing happened. The key met a solid, immovable resistance. "What the?" she muttered, pulling it out and examining it as if the key itself might be faulty. It was the same key she had used 1,000 times. She jammed it back in, turning it with more force. The lock did not give. It was like trying to turn a key in a solid block of steel. "Ben, my key isn't working," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "Try yours." Ben set the suitcases down with a thud and pulled out his own key. "Probably just the humidity," he said dismissively. "The wood swells." He inserted his key and turned. He grunted with effort, his knuckles turning white. The result was the same. The lock was unyielding. Their confident smiles had vanished, replaced by masks of frustration. Did Dad change the lock? Ben grumbled. What is he playing at? A little, petty last-ditch protest? That's just great. It was as he knelt to peer at the lock, looking for any sign of tampering, that he saw it. Propped neatly against the base of the door was a single, crisp white envelope. It was perfectly clean, stark against the dark green paint. He picked it up. "It's for you," he said, handing it to Clara. On the front, in her father's distinctive, steady script, was her name. The handwriting was too firm, too clear. It wasn't the shaky scrawl of the man who had signed her consent forms. A cold knot of dread began to form in the pit of her stomach. She tore the envelope open, her fingers clumsy. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper, folded in 3. She began to read. "My dearest Clara. If you are reading this, then you have returned from your trip, and you have discovered that your key no longer fits the door. I am sorry for the shock this must be, but it is a necessary consequence of events you set in motion. You spoke of selling this house to fund your future. It was a reasonable ambition, but it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. This house was never yours to sell. It was never even mine. 10 years ago your mother, with a foresight I failed to appreciate until now, placed this home into an irrevocable trust. She was worried you saw her legacy not as a collection of memories, but as a collection of assets. It seems her worries were well-founded. The sole legal owner and trustee of the Eleanor Vance Homestead Trust is, and always has been, her sister Margaret Vance. While you and Ben were busy with your realtor, Margaret and I engaged in a separate, legally binding sale of the property. The house was sold yesterday, on Thursday afternoon, to a wonderful young family. I am sure you can appreciate the legal complexities, but in short, the sale you signed off on yesterday was for a property you had no legal right to. The new owners changed the locks this morning. As for the proceeds from the legitimate sale, Margaret and I discussed what Eleanor would have wanted. Your mother spent her last days in the care of a wonderful hospice, surrounded by compassion. Therefore, in accordance with her spirit, the entire net amount from the sale of her home has been donated to a network of charitable hospices in her name. She always valued compassion over currency. I am not at Silver Creek. I am starting a new life in a new town on my own terms. I hope the business acumen you spoke of serves you well in building your future. You will certainly need it now. Goodbye, Clara. Dad. The world tilted. The paper slipped from Clara's nerveless fingers and fluttered to the stone step. The confident, triumphant woman who had stepped out of the SUV moments ago was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed statue. The air seemed to thin, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into a dull, distant roar. Ben snatched the letter from the ground. His eyes scanned the page, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and then curdling into a mask of pure, incandescent rage. "No," he breathed. "No. That's not possible. That old fool. He couldn't have." But the words on the page were absolute. $890,000. Gone. The startup. Gone. The new car, the glass-walled office, the entire shimmering edifice of their future, it had all been a fantasy. An illusion. No. Clara's voice was a raw, animalistic shriek of loss that ripped through the quiet afternoon air. It was a sound of such agony and fury that a neighbor watering his lawn 2 houses down looked up in alarm. "He can't. He can't do this to us. Ben joined her, his own voice a guttural roar. That old bastard. After everything we did for him. He kicked one of their expensive suitcases, sending it tumbling off the porch and onto the lawn, where it burst open, spilling their designer vacation clothes onto the grass. They were screaming now, not with words but with raw, incoherent sounds of rage, pacing the lawn like caged animals. They were screaming at Arthur, at Margaret, at the world, at their own spectacular, crushing ruin. In the midst of their meltdown, the front door opened. A man they had never seen before stood on the doorstep. He was of average height, with kind eyes and a weary expression. A small girl with blonde pigtails clung to his leg, peering out at the screaming strangers on her new lawn. Dr. Hamilton looked at the overturned suitcase, at the man and woman whose faces were contorted in rage, and then at the letter lying on his front step. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through their hysteria. "Can I help you? This is private property." The air in Bayview tasted of salt and renewal. Arthur's new home was a small second-floor apartment in a quiet building that overlooked the harbor. From his modest balcony, he could watch the fishing boats venture out in the gray pre-dawn and return with the gulls screaming in their wake. The apartment was sparse, furnished with simple second-hand pieces that Margaret had helped him pick out. It held no memories, no ghosts. The only echo of his past life was the silver-framed photograph of Eleanor on the beach, which he had placed on the small, clean mantelpiece. He had been here for 3 weeks. The first week had been a blur of disorientation. The following 2 had been a slow, quiet settling. Now he had found a routine. He woke before dawn each morning, made a pot of strong coffee, and sat on his balcony, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, to watch the sun come up over the Atlantic. This morning, the sunrise was particularly spectacular. The horizon began as a faint, bruised purple, which slowly bled into streaks of rose and fiery orange. The light crept across the slate-gray water, turning the crests of the small waves to liquid gold. It was a silent, magnificent performance, and it demanded nothing of him but his attention. In the house on Sycamore Lane, every object, every shadow, had demanded a memory, a reckoning with his grief. Here, there was only the vast, impartial beauty of the natural world. But even here, the guilt was a quiet, persistent tide, ebbing and flowing in the corners of his mind. He had won. He had honored Eleanor's wish. He had outsmarted his own daughter. But the victory felt hollow, laced with a profound parental sorrow. He had not just sold a house, he had surgically removed his only child from his life. He pictured her face, contorted in that final, primal scream he could so easily imagine. Had he been too cruel? Was there another, less destructive path he could have taken? The sound of a key in his apartment door pulled him from his thoughts. A moment later, Margaret stepped onto the balcony, carrying 2 mugs. She placed one on the small table in front of him. The rich aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the salty air. "I saw your light on," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him. She didn't need to ask what he was thinking. She had seen the same conflict in his eyes for weeks. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun free itself completely from the horizon, flooding the world with clean, new light. "I received a letter yesterday," Margaret said finally, her gaze fixed on the water. "From the Eleanor Vance Hospice Foundation. They wanted to thank the trust again. The donation will keep 3 of their rural facilities funded for the next decade. They said it was the most significant gift they had ever received." Arthur wrapped his cold hands around the warm mug. He imagined the rooms his and Eleanor's money would furnish, the comfort it would bring to families in their darkest hours. It was a tangible good, a legacy of pure compassion. "She would have liked that," he said, his voice thick. "Yes, she would have," Margaret agreed. She turned to look at him, her eyes, so like Eleanor's, filled with a gentle understanding. "You know, you didn't do this to Clara, Arthur. You must stop thinking of it that way. You simply stepped out of the way and allowed Clara to reap the consequences of her own choices. Eleanor saw this in her, this deficit of the heart. She didn't create it. She just had the courage to see it for what it was." "She was always stronger than I was," Arthur admitted, staring into his coffee. "She wasn't stronger," Margaret corrected. "She was just fiercely protective of you. She knew your kindness was your greatest strength, but also your greatest vulnerability. She built a fortress around it." All you did was finally pull up the drawbridge. Her words didn't erase his guilt, but they reframed it. He hadn't been an aggressor. He had been a defender of his home, of his dignity, of his wife's memory. A few days later, a letter arrived, forwarded from an old acquaintance. It was from a distant cousin who still lived in Arthur's old neighborhood. The letter was mostly filled with neighborhood gossip, but one paragraph made Arthur's hand tremble. And there was the most dreadful scene at the old Penhaligon house. Clara and her husband were on the lawn, screaming like banshees. The new owners had to threaten to call the police. I hear from Marianne that things are not going well for them. Ben's business partners pulled out of some big deal and they had to sell their SUV. Apparently, the arguments are spectacular. Arthur folded the letter and put it away. There was no triumph in reading it, no sense of vindication. There was only a deep, aching pity for the daughter he no longer knew, a woman so consumed by the life she thought she deserved that she had destroyed the one she actually had. That afternoon he did something he hadn't done yet. He put on his coat and walked down to the small town center. He went into a local nursery, a place brimming with the green, earthy smell of life, and bought a small, sturdy geranium in a clay pot. Back in his apartment, he placed the plant on his balcony table. It was a simple splash of crimson against the gray and blue backdrop of the sea. It was a small, living thing that needed to be tended to. It was an investment in the future. He sat down, not to brood or to wrestle with the past, but to simply feel the sun on his face. The grief for Eleanor was still there, a part of the very fabric of his being, and the sorrow for his daughter was a fresh, tender bruise. But they were no longer the only things he could feel. He felt the warmth of the sun. He heard the cry of the gulls. He saw the vibrant red of the flower. He was still Arthur Penhaligon, a man who had loved and lost. But he was no longer a relic waiting to be discarded. He was a survivor, living in a small room with a vast, magnificent view. The sun was fully up now, and for the first time in a very long time he felt ready for the day.